In today's video, I'm going to show you how I take sunset or sunrise photos. First tip is to know the location of your shoot. Obviously, we actually want to see the sunset or the sunrise, and we were taught back in school that the sun sets in the west and rises in the east. So thank you, education. We want to have unobstructed views of where we want our light to be directed. So use your local map, scout in advance for these kinds of compositions. Or you can also get advanced planning apps like PhotoPills for more precision. For this purpose, I made my way to the Vanilla Beach and the Las Cabañas Beach in the Philippines, which are two west-facing beaches popular to view the sunset in El Nido, Palawan. The next thing to get out of the way is to have a camera where you can adjust the exposure manually. This will allow you to adjust shutter speed and expose for the highlights. For camera users, you can use the aid of the histogram, which shows the brightest values from your blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and the whites. With the histogram, you can avoid clipping represented in spikes towards the edges, meaning that there is no data left to recover in those blown out areas, as there is not enough or too much light collected. Generally, lenses are sharpest in the aperture range of around f8 to f11, and in landscape photography, this is a common aperture range to use because it keeps the depth of field quite deep in the scene and allows for more elements within the frame to be in focus. A lower f number would mean that there is shallower depth of field and keep everything outside of this range out of focus. A higher f number, on the other hand, will increase the depth of field of the image, and this is typical for grand vistas in landscape photography, where you want both the foreground, the midground, and the background in focus. But don't let this restrict you too much, as there are benefits to using a lower f number and blur the background to emphasize your subject for creative storytelling. Just ask these dogs if they agree, as they interrupted my tutorial. So the ISO is a measure of the light sensitivity of the sensor, and generally I will keep it at the lowest possible number, say ISO 100. But I don't mind the compromise of increasing my ISO to introduce a bit more noise if this will mean reducing my shutter speed to something faster. A slower shutter speed would then increase the chances of motion blur in, let's say, waves or anything that moves in the frame. So you might be wondering, it's very unfair that I'm using a very big camera and you're just using a smartphone. But remember, smartphones these days already have a Pro mode where it allows you to adjust the different exposure settings of your smartphone. So I am an iPhone user and I use this third-party app called the Pro Cam, which allows me to adjust my white balance, my ISO, my shutter speed, and apparently it even has a zebra to show me highlight clipping. Androids, as far as I know, also has the Pro mode in their cameras. So all these tips and camera settings do apply even to smartphones. Because photos are viewed on a screen, the viewer will not have the same experience as you did when you're on location. They may never get that same feeling you had because they might be broke and can't go to the same places. So it is important that you capture a coherent story, and one way to do this is to find a subject focus in the image so that the viewer will know exactly what it is that you're trying to photograph and build your story around that subject. So to give an example, I found this island behind me as my clear subject focus because it's super dominant in the scene, and I plan to use these rock formations on the ground because their direction is towards the island behind, and then my midground is going to be the sea. Once you've found the subject, arrange the surrounding elements to strengthen the composition and remove distractions to have a visual flow that makes sense for the viewer. When you're taking sunset or sunrise photos, you're likely aiming for the golden hour, which is a sweet spot when the sun is lower in the horizon and will be casting some softer, flattering light in the scene. And this is a good rule of thumb to capture in landscape photography because the effect is really quite pleasing when the conditions are right. You need to maximize your shooting time, so a tip for you is to go on location rather early, like give yourself at least half an hour before the actual golden hour. And you don't need to panic around when chasing the different compositions. The direction of the sun is a very important consideration to make. So if you're shooting directly into the sun, this will create a very high contrast scene, and the images you take will be backlit or filled with silhouettes. And if you're shooting opposite from the sun or in a different direction, then this will cast some light into your landscape and show some details. You have plenty of options to take, so be creative and just remember that the viewer will be drawn to the areas of highest contrast within an image. So I'll just do this while waiting for the sunset. Additional tips for you to consider when taking the sunset or sunrise photos. Make sure to take the raw images from your camera, because the raw images are all the details that your camera sensor picked up when taking the photo. You want to have as much details as possible so you can have the flexibility of adjusting, let's say, your colors, your white balance, and all the details in your shadow and highlight areas. The second tip is to make use of a tripod as much as possible, because when you're shooting in the sunset or the sunrise time, there is going to be less light in the scene, and this will mean that your shutter speed will be longer, making handheld compositions difficult to manage. And using the tripod will mean that you can take longer exposures without ISO composition, and this will lead to cleaner images later on. Consider the use of bracketing, which is taking 3 or more images of the same composition with different exposure values, with a central or balanced exposure, an underexposed exposure for the highlights or the sky, and an overexposed exposure so you have details in the foreground or your shadow areas. And then you can merge these together in post-processing to have the full dynamic range of the scene. And the ideal weather to shoot the sunset or the sunrise is to have those high fluffy clouds, because this will give you the highest chance of the exploding colors in the sky and some drama effect. A clear sky is a bit boring from a photography perspective because there's nothing going on in the sky, but you can overcome this by focusing more on the minimalism of the scene or making use of that negative space. Just be creative with it. And a final tip is, even if you fail to take the sunset or your sunrise photos, always remember, you're the sunshine. Okay, so I think we're ready to take our sunset photos, so let's find some compositions. Okay, so we are approaching golden hour in a couple of minutes, and my first composition plan was to use those landscapes behind as my subject interest, and the sun will set behind those landscapes. And a while ago there was a boat smack right in the middle of that gap between the two islands, which I thought was going to be a nice, interesting element in the composition, but it left me. I took these photos in the end as the day didn't play out as planned, and when life gives you lemons, you open the tequila and take a shot. So it doesn't look like the sky will give us the colors that we hoped for, but it's okay because tomorrow I still have one more sunset in a place called Nakpan Beach here in El Nido. But if you found the sunset photography tips helpful for you, then I'd appreciate if you can like and subscribe so that this video can spread to more people. So I just arrived at Nakpan Beach and I just found this rather tranquil scene where there's 3 fishing boats floating in the water. The water is a bit calm with some waves happening and big fluffy clouds. Sunset's not until about 1.5 hours, so I plan to take a time lapse while waiting for those moments and find my other compositions. Very beautiful place. So I'm not being given the sunset that I hope for today. No burning color in the sky, but I hope you still found the tips useful from this video, because I know that you can still apply them in your own sunset and sunrise photography. And that's going to be my final tip for you, is to manage your expectations or have realistic expectations, because at the end of it all, the weather will always have the cards for you, and you just have to make the most out of what is provided. So I hope you enjoyed and see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.